All right, everyone, it's time for a little brief thing here about some propaganda that you're seeing lately, like the concept of common sense gun reform, as it's termed. Common sense gun reform already exists within the United States. It's called the Second Amendment. The very concept of codifying the ability of the people at large to own military-style weapons, which is, let's face it, quite literally what it's talking about, was specifically a response to attempted disarmament by their former government, which was the one, by the way, they were shooting at. They were shooting at the troops of their own flag, the regulars, as opposed to the militia, the First Continental Army, being, volunteers led by some former generals, people, in some cases, they had fought for the British military before. It's why they had some expertise in what they were doing. But these ragtag fighters were joined by partisans that weren't even operating at the time under the control of Washington or anybody else. They just went out into the woods and started sniping the British because they were hunters. Some ex-soldiering probably went on, hunters and trappers, explorers and adventurers. Oh, hey, these British, in order to operate, they need to organize columns and march around. It's rather inefficient. It's a lot of people. It's efficient insofar as you're moving massive numbers into a battle. It's not so great at dealing with non-standardized styles of warfare. That's common sense gun reform. A bunch of private civilians are able to muster in defense of the nation. This prevented the Japanese from seriously entertaining the concept of invading the United States. It was entertained for a while, bandied around, and ultimately given up fairly quickly because they said, well, we'd be under constant fire. We'd never establish any beachhead. We'd be destroyed. Our entire military landing at once couldn't overrun even just California. It would never happen. It's in defense of nation. People have to be able to hunt. Of course, it's not the main point of it. That was taken for granted. Defend their property for topical reasons, against a robber, against, some abusive individual. I see it as common sense gun reform for, some little old lady to be able to guard her house from some gang members. I see it as common sense gun reform that when the cop is off the job, he still is capable of defending himself against people who might have a personal vendetta against him. I see it as common sense gun reform for a veteran to still be able to have a weapon that's not comparable to anything used by our military, certainly, but still capable in their hands of being used in defense of the nation. And I want people who would otherwise be victims to be able to protect themselves. I want someone, they've got like a crack snorting ex-boyfriend, wife beater, fucking is going to knock on their door at 3 a.m. and say, oh, bitch, get out of bed and make me pizza. I want her to be able to air him out. I don't want her to be victimized in that situation. The anti-constitutionalists are seeking to use the term gun reform, where gun reform is not what they're actually arguing for. They're arguing simply for a reduction of liberty. It's the only purpose of it. When I look at the crime stats and I see that we're at a 50-year low in gun crime, when I look at those stats and I see that a lot of the gun crime is handgun related, has nothing to do with anything they're arguing for, when I look at the fact that they're seeking to disarm large swaths of the population that are totally lawful, of classes of weapons for no reason because they're not even more than scantily used in gun crime, when I see the fact that the crime statistics for 20 years have not matched up with their reality, that is, there are more firearms in more hands now than at any other time in our history, yet there's less gun crime than there has been since the 1960s. When I see all of these things, I say what they are arguing for cannot be considered reform, because their arguments are nonsense. They're not real. It's based on a bunch of fakery. And it's being led by people, by the way, that they pretend to be benevolent, a Feinstein, someone like that. Some of the Republicans have joined, John Paul Stevens, of course, senile as he is, being one of them. Someone pointed out, it was funny, they said, well, he's a Republican, a conservative Republican. Yes, he's also demented. Quite literally, it was one of the things he pointed out when he quit the Supreme Court. That was years ago. He's way more demented now. He knew he couldn't do his job. He couldn't make the right decisions because he couldn't think as straight as he used to when he was, not totally fucking decrepit. How much more mentally incapable is he now? Now, and these same people will be the same ones saying that old people shouldn't make our policy decisions. Young people, you need to listen to the youth. But at the same time, there are people within the youth that totally disagree with you. I don't hear anything from them. They're not being platformed by the corporate media, and I strongly suspect a rather non-organic element to a lot of what's happened in the wake of Parkland. It seems like it's being spurned on by a bunch of authoritarians, a bunch of corporate media assholes, a bunch of jackboot-sucking moralists, and a bunch of idiots within DC who, after all, you trust them to disarm a bunch of people? You trust them to do anything at this point? Look, the President of the United States, according to half of these people, is Adolf Hitler. So if the President's a tyrant, why on earth would you want to reduce people's right to bear arms? Doesn't make sense. By the way, Trump largely, as it seemed, at least for a while, agreed with you on these things. Maybe that was an attempt to poison pill the whole conversation, maybe not, and who cares? But that's not gun reform. What they're arguing for is unconstitutional, number one. Number two is against the spirit of the founding of the United States. You can talk about the legality of a million different things. It's about the spirit of our founding. It goes beyond, the Constitution's not just a piece of paper, it's an idea. It enumerates rights. It doesn't give you any rights. The Constitution enumerates natural rights that you simply do have. You have the right to express yourself. You have the right to defend yourself. States as organized were sovereign entities. Federal authority is limited. People have a right to privacy. They have a right not to be tossed in a jail cell without a proper trial. They have the right to cross-examine and all of these other wonderful things, many of which for the first time were codified in the U.S. Constitution. Look around the world. You can find countries that are safer than the U.S. and countries that are less safe than the U.S. insofar as gun crime goes. The number that are safer have declined drastically over time, it seems. And you'll notice something in common with those states that don't really have, let's say, a significant amount of personal firearm ownership. The government walks all over them, corporations walk all over them, and they're slaves. They're not citizens. They don't ultimately, they don't have a right to do anything because they don't have the ability to enforce their rights. Ultimately, we may not like this fact, but in a pragmatic sense, might is right. In a pragmatic sense, the only way for a group of people to truly remain autonomous is to be well armed. And when people say, well, you're talking about treason. No, I'm saying if the government were ever to get to the point where the corruption were so systemic that it was a tyranny that became unacceptable, the quality of life had degraded to such a point that people are no longer able to tolerate it, they'd best hope that they're well armed enough to restore their situation. It's literally what the revolution was. The revolution was not fought against a foreign government. It was fought against the people's own government because they were British citizens at the time. Subjects, I should say. They were colonials. They weren't being represented. The people that were supposed to represent their interests, the governing body, didn't do so and repeatedly attempted to abuse them. Sound familiar? That's exactly what people are worried about. And then there's also the more pragmatic, on-the-ground, day-to-day argument. A person needs to be well-armed enough to defend themselves against topical abuse, against the robber, against the mugger, against the would-be rapist, and things like that. And there are many examples where shop owners or little old ladies and everybody else under the sun have used firearms and other weapons to defend themselves. It's not even in their mind, oh, I've got to defend the nation against tyranny. It's not even in their mind. And for people who would tell them, well, you don't need an AR-15 to do that. You just buy this revolver or have a shotgun or something. Who are you, morally speaking, to tell them what weapon they can and cannot use to defend themselves against a criminal? You're quite literally siding with criminals at that point. You're saying, well, somehow it matters whether the criminal is killed by a six-shooter or shotgun or a sporting rifle. And you don't even know anything about these weapons. Most of you apparently have never held one. Most of the people that are marching in these situations, they're urbanites, number one. They have little to no actual working knowledge of firearms, number two. And they're being represented by people who, in my opinion, appear more and more to simply be opportunistic. So to the point where you've got someone openly talking about, oh yeah, I bullied the Parkland shooter and I don't regret it at all. Okay. So sort of corroborating the concept that he had been abused and snapped. Of course he was a lunatic. Of course what he did took a lot of innocent lives. But then there are other people who are apparently still above ground who contributed to the fucking problem. I would think that makes them at least a little bit morally culpable. You've got people who have formed a sort of weird worship cult around this movement, to the point at which if you criticize what they say, is people say, well, you want dead children, Or you're a gun nut. I've heard the term gun nut or ammo-sexual quite frequently. So, in other words, a person who owns one AR-15 and no other firearms, somehow there's something mentally wrong with them for wanting to defend themselves. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That's like saying, oh, well, you decided to go with the industrial printer. You're a First Amendment fanatic. Who fucking cares? It's none of your business. The first motto of the United States was mind your own business. If I had been Ben Franklin at the time, I would have suggested, we need something stronger. How about fuck off and mind your own fucking business? That sounds better to me. I think that would have been far better. And I think we should have stuck with, we never should have been e pluribus unum or in God we trust. It should still be mind your own damn business. That's exactly what we should do that. By the way, Hail Columbia should be the national anthem, not the stuff we have now. Better anthem, prior to the 1930s. Things get weird in the 30s through the 50s. Ike was the one who imposed In God We Trust to combat communism by reminding people they were supposed to worship Jesus Christ. Well, Jesus isn't going to save you from tyranny. Never has, never will. It never saved any person who was subject to some crazy despotic king back in the medieval ages. It never saved anyone from some violent purge by a bunch of drunken crusaders who decided to stop by in Constantinople and sack the city for no reason because they were fucked up. No, it's not going to save anybody. But you know what will save them is their liberty teeth. You're not suggesting violence by suggesting resistance to violence. It seems that there are people who honestly seem to believe that the vast bulk of gun owners are violent people. They're not. Very, very small number of people in the country are violent. It's borne out by the crime stats showing a decrease in violent crime over time to the low levels that they're now, historically speaking, actually at. A lot of guns, relatively few gun crimes. Oh, far more guns than in the 50s. And as few gun crimes. Now, how can this be? I thought where there are more guns, there are more crimes. That's funny. Anytime one of these shootings happens, it's never some bunker-dwelling, body armor-wearing, come-and-take-it flag waver. It's never anybody like that. It's some fucking psychopath that recently gets into firearms and is screwed up. The kind of people you don't want to meet in an alley who, kills a cat with a fork or something. Weirdos. Weirdos and gang members are primarily responsible for gun crime within the U.S. If you want to get rid of the gangs, I can tell you exactly how the fuck to do it. End the fucking drug war and divert those funds to policing other crimes. Decrease gun restrictions. Let private citizens take care of it. They pulled the sheriffs of America a while back. I think it was a number of years ago. The vast majority of them are totally against the concept of additional gun control because, trust me, look, if I'm a boy in blue and I'm showing up to a scene, I don't want to have to draw my gun and worry about getting shot. I'm hoping that the criminal's already been subdued. Now, the criminal probably has a gun, while hopefully somebody else around them has a gun. There have been cases where private citizens take care of it. The Garland shooting, it could have been a massacre. Garland, Texas gets attacked by an Islamic extremist who's well armed enough, he could have done a considerable amount of damage. He got killed by a mall cop. Not a boy in blue who, goes around in a squad car. A mall cop, a private citizen working for a private security firm, gunned him down. And so the only casualty was the terrorist. How many people do you think were saved that day? You never want to talk about that would-be attack. Never want to talk about Kent State either. Before these people from Parkland tell you about how wonderful and benevolent government is, and you're just crazy if you think you'd ever need to defend yourself against the government. It could never be tyrannical. Number one, W. Bush. Let me remind you that you were all saying he was tyrannical back then. And oh goodness, he's denigrating our rights. Free speech zones are unconstitutional, which I agree with you. Yeah, and all of a sudden now you're rolling over and playing dead because the establishment has convinced you through a multi-billion-dollar campaign that you no longer need to be free. It's crazy. But yeah, look at Kent State, number 2, and then tell me, why don't you think you ever hear about that shooting incident? I wonder why. Google it. Google it and then tell me government is invariably benevolent. Nobody should be suspicious of its motives. No, I'm going to remain suspicious of its motives. Yeah, when Obama said, people will say that tyranny is always lurking around the corner, you should reject those voices, he is literally echoing the exact opposite sentiment of one of our actually great presidents, Thomas Jefferson. Why don't you read through the Federalist Papers, find out what our founders actually intended with the Second Amendment? It was understood government could become bad. They had just suffered under a bad government. Now, supposedly, the British were the freest in the world. Our government's perfect. We've got representation. But it didn't work because people couldn't fight back. And when they started to fight back, they had to wage a literal war over the issue. So, yeah, there's a little bit of a polemic here on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment itself was meant to be gun reform, and it worked pretty damn well. We're not exactly suffering from the attrition rates of, any non-developed part of the world. All of them are invariably more stricken by violence than us. All of them are less free. Invariably, it's invariable when you're trying to compare it to other countries for the purposes of propaganda. You only want to compare it to Western Europe. Nowhere else in the world. Yeah, it would be wrong to compare it to countries with different socioeconomic levels. Oh, so you're saying that they're more violent, so poor people are more violent is basically what you're saying. How very funny for you. Yeah, yet I'm the one with a problem. Yeah, own one firearm, therefore amosexual. Over the age of 19, therefore argument invalid, I guess. No, that's not the way that it works. That's called propaganda, and trust me, your mind is being played with. If you believe all this shit, you're the victim of propaganda. I guarantee you that it's the result of backdoor meetings involving government and corporate media. Absolutely guarantee it. There's no question in my mind. Stranger things have happened. Look, but why do you think that the government dismantled the only prohibition on the government working with the corporate media to create propaganda on the radio waves and on news anyway? Obama ripped that apart. He got rid of it. Until then, it was banned. The media couldn't work directly with the government for propaganda purposes. At least it couldn't openly, legally do so. Now they can. Government can put out ads on, you know why it is? Because they wanted to be able to put out government-sponsored ads on Facebook and things like that. The Air Force runs tens of thousands of bot accounts on Facebook. Did you know that? That was big time at back in like 2006 or so when it was first reported on. That was quite a popular story until it mysteriously disappeared off Facebook. I wonder why. Yeah, people don't know what they're getting into. Trust me. You don't want to give up your liberty, and we're being warned right now by people who know better than we do because we haven't had that problem. Look, it's just like when the Eastern Europeans warn people about post-national authority, it's because they've lived under it. They know the horrors of it because they were under the boot of the USSR. We've got people in countries that are disarmed telling us, don't give up your guns, don't back down and give an inch. Fight back, even like this de facto bump stock ban. You need to fight back against these things. Absolutely. And they know what they're talking about. Look, no American has ever lived in a situation where they're disarmed. In some states, you've got draconian gun control, yeah, and variously, sometimes the courts rip it apart. But, you have the ability to own firearms. Nobody's going to come knocking on your door in the dead of night to punch you in the face, say, get the fuck down on the ground because you owned the wrong weapon, unless it didn't conform to legitimate firearm law. It's not going to happen, but in Western Europe, yeah, you're damn right you will. Bin the knife. You can't even have a butter knife without an ID in that country. In the UK, you can't even buy like a BB gun in some of these countries. Meanwhile, I think in Eastern Europe, they tore up most of their restrictions. I think like fully auto weapons and like civilian tanks and weird shit like that is all over the place in some parts of the world. Funnily enough, some of them are even safer than the U.S. So you go to like when they talk about us having a lot of problems with this. You can go to Cambodia, and for a few $100s, you can actually get an old rocket launcher and a bunch of rockets and take it out to a range. Or a high-caliber, fully automatic machine gun, or you can drive a tank around, one that'll actually fire. You can do these things in certain parts, so you can go out to Afghanistan and buy crates of hand grenades. Probably not the greatest example, because, that is racked by violence. Religious violence, but, you understand. So, yeah, we need to defend our right to bear arms. It's a right. It's not a privilege. And there shouldn't be a national debate on it. I don't really care about the polling on the situation. That's called the tyranny of the majority. It's called direct democracy. That is a problem. There's a reason we're a republic. That's about all. Peace out.